my very dear friend and brother in the pursuit of peace, Doug Hostetter.
Thank you, Dionne. Good afternoon. I'm Doug Hostetter, the director of the Mennonite Central Committee United Nations Office, also a member of the Bureau of the Committee of Religious NGOs here at the UN. I volunteered to organize the April meeting of our group on peace, justice, and just institutions. And as I was doing the organizing, I suddenly realized that this was also the 50th anniversary of the famous speech of Dr. Martin Luther King at Riverside Church on time to break the silence, which brought together the issues of peace, justice, and war in a way in which no other preachers in the United States at this time or orators were quite doing. It was an incredible speech, and I knew that King had something to tell us today for what we should be doing, and also to tell the United Nations for what we should be doing as we move into our Sustainable Development Goals and our 2030 Agenda. King's speech had special resonance for me because I graduated from college in 1966 and was immediately draft eligible to be drafted and sent to the Vietnam War. Now, fortunately, I grew up in a Mennonite family, and Mennonites have been refusing subscription for almost 500 years, so becoming a conscientious objector was a natural thing for me to do. But as I looked at my generation and realized that my colleagues were being drafted against their will to go and fight and kill in Vietnam, I felt that I should do my alternative service in Vietnam, but working with the Mennonites, using only the weapons of love and truth. And then perhaps we could see which weapons were better at transforming the difficult situation in Vietnam. The Mennonites sent me to the small village of Dam Qui in Quang Nam province in central Vietnam, an area that was already heavily under combat. They told me to go and find out what the refugees wanted and try to help them to do it. I was astounded to learn that the refugees wanted most for their children to learn to read and write their own language. As I was barely learning Vietnamese myself, I realized I couldn't do this. So I organized a group of Vietnamese high school students to be volunteer teachers, to teach Vietnamese children whose schools had been destroyed by the American War. We had 90 high school students and educated more than 3,000 Vietnamese children. It was a thing that changed my life. I was in Vietnam, in Dam Qui, when Dr. Martin Luther King gave his speech at Riverside Church. I was sitting there in the middle of the war zone, in the middle of a war. And a year later, after King had been assassinated and Robert Kennedy had been assassinated, I wrote this in my journal. I am so sick and revolted. I want to cry, to curse, to break windows, to kick down doors. I can't believe it. It's too tragic to be true. America, America, you are paying dearly for your love of violence and destruction. You thought you could teach people to kill, to settle their arguments with guns and with bombs. And you discovered that it has been turned on you. You thought that you could kill Vietnamese safely in your planes, high above the ground. But you have discovered that Americans have learned their lesson too well. We have sown a wind and reaped a whirlwind. Long have you caused suffering, and now you are killing your own. Why am I in Vietnam when my country is so sick? God, forgive us. teach us a better way. We are indeed privileged today that my friend and Ambassador Nguyen Phuong will be reading the part of Dr. King's speech that talks about the relationship of the war in Vietnam, the racism and poverty in the United States. We are very honored to have the permanent representative of Vietnam in our midst. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
First of all, I would like to thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to be here with you today, celebrating Martin Luther King and his legacy. Now I have the honor to read to you a part of his famous sermon, Beyond Vietnam, a time to break silence. At this point, I should make it clear that while I am trying in these last few minutes to give a voice to the voiceless on Vietnam and to understand the arguments of those who are called enemy, I am as deeply concerned about our troops there as anything else. For it occurs to me that what we are submitting them to in Vietnam is not simply the brutalizing process that goes on in any war where armies face each other and seek to destroy. We are adding cynicism to the process of death, for they must know after a short period there that none of the things we claim to be fighting for are really involved. Before long, they must know that their government has sent them into struggle among Vietnamese. And the more sophisticated surely realize that we are on the side of the wealthy and the secure, while we create help for the poor. Somehow this madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as a child of God and brother to the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for those whose land is being laid waste, whose homes are being destroyed, whose culture is being subverted. I speak for the poor of America, who are paying the double price of smashed hopes at home and death and corruption in Vietnam. I speak as a citizen of the world, for the world as it stands aghast at the path we have taken. I speak as an American to the leaders of my own nation. The great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours. I thank you.
Thank you. We are very privileged to have with us Ambassador Chowdhury, who is very well known about the UN as one of the people who is most active and most dedicated to putting peace and justice into practice. Ambassador Anwarul Chowdhury was in 2002, the Secretary General of the UN appointed him to be the Undersecretary General and High Representative for the least developed countries, landlocked and developed countries, and small island developing states. He has spent his time at the UN working on behalf of the poor and working for a just and peace within our world. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon to all of you.
Good afternoon.
I'm very, very deeply honored to be invited to speak at this very special occasion. Thank you, Reverend Dionne, hosting us at the church center, at the Tillman Chapel, which I call the fountain of spiritual energy for all of us who are working on this side of the street and on that side of the street. I also would like to pay a special sort of note or a special tribute, I should say, for the words of Mama Ruby Sales. I think those were extremely powerful words. As I was preparing to be present here, I was recalling that in the same week, 2 years ago, I was invited to a special ceremony at the Morehouse College by the Martin Luther King Jr. College of Ministers and Laity by Lawrence Carter, Reverend Lawrence Carter, who is the principal there. And I was honored to receive from there the Gandhi King Ikeda Award for Community Leadership for Peace. And I was there for the 8th and 9th of April. That is when Reverend King's body, mortal remains were lying there in state at the Morehouse College before being buried. And I also at the same time was recalling that in January 2009, I was invited to be a keynote speaker in Los Angeles by the Martin Luther King Day Celebration Committee. This celebration they are having annually for last maybe 30 plus years. And in those years, I was the first non-American to be invited to speak there as a keynote speaker. So I remember that occasion also with deep honor and sense of gratitude to our friends all over the world. This is the 50th anniversary of what we call breaking the silence speech. But breaking the silence has been Dr. King's life. Breaking the silence against injustice, against discrimination, against prejudice, and also raising the voice for peace, raising the voice for human rights, raising the voice for eradication of poverty. That is what he was. I am very happy that Swami Paramesh mentioned about all our sort of the global mentor, if I may say, spiritual mentor, Mahatma Gandhi. And Mahatma had said that non-violence, and I am quoting him, non-violence is the greatest and most active force in the world. No one cannot be passively non-violent. One person who can express ahimsa, that is the non-violence in life, exercises force superior to all the force of brutality. And that was Dr. King in every sense of that expression, all through his adult life. He, Dr. King, considered his Nobel Peace Prize as, and I quote, a profound recognition that nonviolence is the answer to the critical political and racial questions of our time. The need for man to overcome oppression without resorting to violence. End of quote. Elevating the principle to where it truly belongs. Dr. King affirmed that, and I quote, "Admittedly, nonviolence in the truest sense is not a strategy that one uses simply because it is expedient at the moment. Nonviolence is ultimately a way of life that men live by because of the sheer morality of its claim." End of quote. What a profound statement that is. The flourishing of the culture of peace and nonviolence will generate a mindset which I believe is the prerequisite for the transition from force to reason, from conflict and violence to dialogue and peace. It will provide the bedrock to support a stable, progressing and prospering world, a world that is at peace with itself. As Dr. King had said, and I quote, "We will never have peace in the world until men everywhere recognize that ends are not cut off from means, because the means represent the ideal in the making and the end in process. Ultimately, you cannot reach good ends through evil means, because the means represent the seed and the ends represent the tree." End of quote. Nonviolence can truly flourish when the world is free of poverty, hunger, discrimination, and exclusion. When women and men can realize their highest potential and live in a secure and fulfilling life. Until then, each and every one of us would have to contribute collectively and individually to build peace through nonviolence. We have to succeed together, or together we will perish. Dr. King had underscored very forcefully that, and I quote again, "Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals." End of quote. He went on even further to connect the role of individuals to broader global objectives when he said that, and I quote, an individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. I believe that that is the essence of all our efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the United Nations. That is what will create a global citizen in each one of us who will connect his or her goals and objectives with the broader goal and objectives of the world, of the United Nations. And that is very important. Poverty and lack of opportunities deprive people of their dignity as human beings, leaving them hopeless and incapable of pursuing even a basic minimum quality of life. I have seen this from close quarters as I traveled extensively in the poorest and the most vulnerable countries of the world, championing their cause in my last responsibility in the United Nations. Marginalization and abuse because of ethnicity, gender, or religion are all closely linked to poverty and the concurrent lack of basic human rights in many parts of our world. As a visionary, Dr. King called for an all-out world war against poverty. He added that, and I quote, "The rich nations must use their vast resources of wealth to develop the underdeveloped, school the unschooled, and feed the unfed," end of quote. And he highlighted the oneness of humanity by affirming poignantly that all, and I quote, "all life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny," end of quote. The international community over the years has been endeavoring to establish the universality of peace and human rights. The United Nations, in its charter, recognized peace as central to its existence and affirmed that it is both a prerequisite and a consequence of the full enjoyment of human rights by all. In this context, I find Dr. King's words very uplifting when he said that, and I quote, "The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and the cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people," end of quote. He also very appropriately directed us to the obvious choice when he asked whether the humanity would, and I quote, "walk in the light of creative altruism or in the darkness of destructive selfishness," end of quote. In my view, the culture of peace can provide an effective moral framework to deploy world's resources for poverty eradication and for sustainable development. I'm truly heartened when I find that Dr. King and say, and that quote is highlighted in our program today. And I quote, "A nation," this is worth quoting time and again, "a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." Reflecting situations in many countries in today's global political setup, he even went on to say that, and I quote, "millions of citizens are deeply disturbed that the military-industrial complex," and to that I add, if I may, military-industrial corporate complex, too often shapes national policy. But they do not want to be considered unpatriotic, end of quote. As a set of values, mode of behavior, and way of life based on respect for life, human rights, non-violence, and the economic and social well-being of each and every human person, the culture of peace can be a powerful tool in promoting the global consciousness that serves the best interest of a just and sustainable peace. Dr. King advised us that, and I quote, "we must concentrate not merely on the negative expulsion of war, but the positive affirmation of peace," end of quote. Putting our efforts in the right context, he clarified that, again I quote, "peace is not not merely a distant goal that we seek, but a means by which we arrive at that goal. End of quote. Reiterating what Dr. King had always emphasized, that the time is always right to do what is right. I would call for undertaking now two things that are needed to achieve and sustain peace in the world by breaking out of the vicious poverty conflict cycle. One, we need to improve the objective living conditions of the whole of humanity through poverty eradication, economic development, and good governance and democratization, and the respect for human rights. Number two, we also need to change the subjective conditions that breed conflict, our beliefs and our prejudices, by cultivating the values of tolerance, understanding, in short, the culture of peace in our mindsets. Peace should become a part of our daily existence. It is particularly important to ensure that the children benefit from education and upbringing that promote tolerance, respect for diversity and human dignity, and peaceful and non-violent ways of resolving conflict. In the brochure of the Morehouse College, Dr. King's excerpt from the Nobel speech is mentioned, and I quote him again. I have the audacity to believe that people everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. End of quote. Celebrating Dr. King's life here across the United Nations, I have the pleasure to say that a lot of efforts have been made to promote the culture of peace in the global forums. In 1999, the United Nations adopted the Declaration and Program of Action on the Culture of Peace. Here it is, a monumental document that transcends boundaries, cultures, societies, and nations. Promoting the culture of peace in today's tension-ridden world, I believe, is a true legacy of Dr. King. It has the potential of being transformed into a truly universal movement that builds a global citizenry whose everyday actions are guided by the values of peace, justice, and nonviolence. In this context, we always recall what Dr. King had said, and I quote, "We must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love." There is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. End of quote. Whether it is at events such as this, in places of worship, in schools, or in our homes, a lot can be achieved in promoting the culture of peace through individual resolve and action. This is the only way we shall achieve a just and sustainable peace in the world. Learning about the culture of peace having the potential or personal transformation should be incorporated in all educational institutions as a part of their curriculum, and should become an essential part of our educational process as reading and writing. As Dr. King had advised us rightly, and I quote, "I suggest that the philosophy and strategy of nonviolence become immediately a subject for study and for serious experimentation in every field of human conduct, by no means excluding the relations between nations. Let me conclude by quoting another gem from Dr. King, the conscience of humanity, if I may call him, who taught us the need to overcome our ignorance of one another. And I quote, "If we lose hope, somehow you lose the vitality that keeps life moving. You lose that courage to be, that quality that helps you to go on in spite of all. And so today, I still have a dream." End of quote. His dream continues to sustain us, to struggle against injustice and oppression, wherever those occur. Let us remember that the work of peace is a continuous process. Each of us can make a difference in that process. It is not enough to remember Dr. King just one day or one occasion or one anniversary. Not enough to admire him. We should internalize his message, reflect him in our lives. We are all inheritors of the legacy of this great apostle of peace. We have the responsibility to keep his spirit alive so that humanity can benefit, so that we can all live for greater good of all. Only then the world will be a better place to live for us, for our children, and for our grandchildren. Thank you.